So what about, it was an interesting story about your trip home on the boat, occupying yourself, reading a book, finding a place to get a little rest, having to contend with that cannon.
I had promised myself that when I arrived on the soil of the USA, that I was gonna get down on my knees, kiss the soil and give thanks. And I didn't intend ever to leave the United States again. Of course I did, because you know how airlines developed. But I did kiss the soil when I got down. And as I got down off that gangplank, as I was waiting to get on the gangplank to go down, the ship was moved by a tugboat very slowly up to the pier. There was a huge crowd on the pier. Apparently a good many of the people had been informed and were nearby that their loved one was aboard that ship. So there was a lady on that pier, and the ship was coming up close, and she could see her husband. She spied him. She just looked at him. And when she did, she got so excited, she started running toward the edge of that pier, and people who were close to her grabbed her to keep her from running off into the water, because the water was probably 40 feet below. There was press members with their cameras there also. So these people held her. The guy's level in the ship was such they could hold her up. She kissed him, and that picture was on the front page of the Los Angeles paper the following day.
Wow.
Just a little interesting aside. So we went, I'm not sure what the base was that we went to there. I don't even know if it was a naval base or a army base or marine or whatever. But we went there for housing and food and so forth, and to be processed with given train tickets, because we weren't going together anymore. We were going everybody in his own direction. So I was scheduled to go to Camp Fannin, Texas. And I recall that there was a man there named Scott, who I discovered was going to be on the same train as me. And he went by the nickname of Scotty. He was a sergeant, and we kind of like became buddies enough for the train trip, which didn't take us but something less than 48 hours. And we went, he was going to Camp Fannin, Texas, the same as I was. There were other people on that troop train, but some of them got off in Flagstaff, Arizona. Some of them got off that train in San Bernardino, California. I don't remember all the other stops that we went to, but it was a troop train. And when we got to Flagstaff, there was a couple of 3 officers that were riding with the troops on that troop train, taking us back to our stations. So when this train stopped and got on a sidetrack in Flagstaff, some of the bolder people jumped off the train, ran across the street to a liquor store, came back with 3 or 4 guys, came back with about a half a dozen bottles of whiskey in their hands. the officer in charge of that plane met them as they came to get on a plane
On the
and
train?
took on the train, back on the train, and took that liquor away from him. Of course, he had some helpers there with him, and he took those bottles of whiskey and burst them on the railroad track. And the guys had to get on the train. They were going to get left if they didn't. They were sad-looking guys, I'll tell you that.
No tailgating on the train.
No tailgating on the train. Well, we traveled across the USA, and it was a sightseeing thing for me out the train and one of the places that we passed was close enough to the Grand Canyon that I could see the Grand Canyon from the train window. That was an experience. I saw it years later from other promontories. I arrived in Camp Fannin, Texas, and we were being processed out there. There were a large number of people who were there from other locations on the globe. Not all of them had come on a train from California. I don't know how many. Only Scotty and I, that I recall, arrived in a building where we were going to be processed and discharged. We didn't even spend the night. We just arrived there and went to where we were instructed, and we had our duffel bag with us with a few items that belonged to us. In fact, one of the items that was in my duffel bag was a Japanese rifle, which I had procured on Iwo Jima, and I had taken it in two pieces and secreted it in my duffel bag and brought it home, and I gave it to my nephew when I arrived in Louisiana.
So Fannin, Texas, what was the process to get discharged? You said something at one point to me about like an exit interview or something. What was that
Yes,
like?
they
What
had
was
an
that
exit
about?
interview. There was a process that they went by. You took your duffel bag and parked it outside of his office, and you waited in line to go in and talk to whoever the guy was. So the guy that had me was a young fella. Clearly he was well educated, but he didn't have any rank. But at any rate, he was processing me out, and he was trying to talk me into re-enlisting in the military because people were so anxious to get out that there wasn't going to be enough people to remain in. I didn't want to be in the military. I had had my fill of being in the military. So I said, I'm aware that you have a job to do, and I'm not angry at you. I'm very happy that you're going to process me out, but I don't want to talk about re-enlisting. I don't want to hear a word about that, because he was trying to promise me to send me to OCS and get a commission and, you know, a year or two of college and all that business. So this was a ripe opportunity. So I said, I'll make a deal with you. I know you got to talk to me, but I'll sit here and be courteous to you until you finish the process. If you'll just not mention re-enlisting again. He laughed, and I chuckled a little bit, but I was glad he didn't answer. He didn't mention that anymore. So I was given my discharge, which is a piece of paper in an envelope, and my duffel bag. walked out the gate. Didn't have anybody coming to meet me. No people in my family didn't have vehicles, and there weren't very many vehicles in USA at the time, because that was still wartime. And by the way, that was 1946, February, that I was getting out. And there had been no automobiles manufactured for civilian use in the United States of America during the years from the end of 1942. My oldest sister bought a 1942 Ford, and it's the only 42 Ford I saw until after the war. There were none. I saw 42 Fords that were command cars overseas and used by the officers to haul the generals around, but there were no automobiles manufactured for civilian use. There were a few tires that were sold to put on the ones that were still in use. Since I didn't have a ride, I hitchhiked home. By the time I got home, which was about 90 to 110 miles, somewhere in that range, from Camp Fannin, Texas, by the time I got home, I learned that my brother Frank had been discharged the week before. We hadn't seen each other for 28 months. That's when I last left. And before I last left to go into the military, I had gone to visit Frank in Camp Hood, Texas. And that would have been in 1943 in November. I was glad to get home. Frank was glad to get home. I'm not sure my mom and dad were glad that we were coming in, because each one of us had made out an allotment to our parents who were dependent on us for a livelihood when we went in the military. And from my $50 the first month, I had allocated that they should send to my mother $20 a month. Frank had allocated $20 a month to Papa. And so they had $40 a month coming into them. And since that was at the end of the Great Depression, neither Frank nor I had transportation, and certainly our parents didn't. So when we would go to Provencal, we had to walk 5 miles or hitchhike 5 miles up the road from Leesville to Hagewood, Louisiana, where the highway ran from Leesville to Natchitoches. So we got busy having $100 or $2 in my pocket, and him having, we didn't have any money, just our final pay, because we were getting our final paycheck from the military at the day we were discharged. So we looked around and found an old vehicle chassis with a broken engine and purchased it from a friend of ours. And we got another friend to overhaul it and repair it enough that we could drive it. That took about a month. After that month, then we had a vehicle which enabled us to do things that we shouldn't do. Go other places and spend our money. Go see our friends we hadn't seen since before the war, and we did. We did. My best friend that I finished high school with lived 1.5 miles from me. He was back home and we were very happy to be together again, to go catfishing in the creeks, to run up and down the road and drink beer. That didn't please our parents, but we learned that in the military. A little secret that they never did learn was I didn't drink any of my alcoholic allotment, which was 6 bottles of beer per month when I was on Iwo Jima after the war was over.
So you were intending to go back to LSU.
Oh yes, I was anxious to go back to LSU because I had enjoyed it. I needed an education and I knew it. And we had a GI Bill which was going to pay us a certain amount per month to enable us to get our degree. Frank had the GI Bill too, but he hadn't started to college and was not as dedicated to the idea, because after all, when he was discharged, he was 33 years old. I was 20 years old. So I wanted to get back to LSU immediately, and I had already investigated with the university. They would have permitted me to begin the spring semester in 1946 and register late. Frank could have done the same thing too, but he wouldn't go with me. So I wanted and decided, well, I'll wait for you then, because I would like for you to go with me. And he said, we'll go, I'll join with you in the summer. So they had summer sessions. But when summer came, June, from February to June, he and I had enjoyed what we were doing, rambling around, collecting what the government gave out in the form of $20 a week. It was jokingly called 5220. 52 weeks, veterans were given $20 a week if they couldn't get employment. Well, there was no employment for veterans in Provencal. There hadn't been any before the war, and there certainly was none after the war. You either worked on the farm or something. You didn't work for pay. So we drew our $20 a week as unemployment, went and signed up again every 2 weeks, and we continued to do that from February until June came. We continued after June because he would not go to LSU with me. Frank would not leave and go to LSU with me. We were having a good time. He promised to go with me in September if I would wait. So I said, I'm going to wait. I will stay here with you until September, and if you don't go with me then, I'm going to go back by myself. So that was in Baton Rouge. Then I was to go to school 175 miles away from Provencal. September came and he did go with me. And we got on a train in Provencal. You want to hear a funny story? I was so happy that Frank was going to go to college because he and his older brothers and sisters and I would talk a little bit, and they had convinced me that Frank had a kind of a little inferiority complex because he hadn't been to college or nurses training or anything. But he'd stayed out of that kind of thing because he had been in the military for 5 years. And also, I learned later on that his girlfriend refused to marry him because he told her that he couldn't marry her at the time. He had to take care of a disabled pair of parents. So he not only had not gone to college because he was taking care of his father and mother, but I was a teenager, so was Ruth, so was Royce at home. So he stayed there to take care of us and to take care of the farm. So I owed him. I wanted to thank him. And so I took him back with me to LSU, and we found out right quick that the GI Bill would not be enough money to sustain us, pay for our education, and so forth, and we both had to find a part-time job to enable us to continue till we got our degree. So having worked at the dairy department before I went in the military, I knew the ropes at that. So I went to the student employment office, and Frank and I were each able to get a job with the dairy department. He worked in the creamery, and I went back to the dairy milking cows. We continued with that activity until we graduated. Since I had already had 37 hours of credit prior to the war, I finished ahead of him. I graduated in 1949, and he graduated in 1950. So I was thrilled. This older brother of mine had his degree in agricultural economics, just as I did. We majored in the same department. And he was 37 years old. He became a professional and worked for the government until he retired.
Well, Dad, this has been fascinating from June of 42 to September. Well, you brought us all the way into 49 and 50. But I thank you for your time, and we'll continue on. What was that like, returning home, actually being there on the farm, and then what happened, in the interim, before you were able to return to LSU? What was going on with that?
I had plans to return to LSU immediately, so I turned to my brother Frank, who was discharged at the same time, same week I was. He had spent his 5 years in the military in the United States because he had limited service from being one-eyed. So he was a military policeman and spent most of his time escorting prisoners of various kinds on trains to various locations in the United States, delivering them to a permanent prison location or wherever they had to go. So I asked him to go with me to register at LSU because he hadn't been to college, and I wanted him to have that experience because it was going to be a life-changing thing to him, just like our military service and the war had been a life-changing thing. I knew that because I had been to LSU, and he was not aware of that. So he would not agree to go with me. He said, well, let's enjoy being at home with Mom and Dad, and we did. And so I planned to enter LSU again in June. When June came, he said, no, if you wait until September, I'll go with you. He did. We went in September, and that began our time at LSU, and eventually graduated from there in 1949, and he graduated in 1950.
Let me ask you about this. So, in returning to LSU, with the mandatory ROTC, you had already done your military. But so what was the circumstances of that? I don't know how LSU was set up for, ROTC. Just you didn't have to join again, did you?
No. Veterans were exempt from that, Tom.
I see. I didn't know.
Yeah, they were exempt from ROTC. Dan, there were tons of them. Veterans had returned, and I graduated with a good many of them. One of the people that you know that I graduated with from LSU was Ralph D'Artes Sr. And we stood in line, both of us, in the dust of the Coliseum to go receive our diplomas in the LSU Coliseum when we graduated.